Support is our greatest motivation to keep working hard. Once again, thank you all for your attention and companionship. Next, thoroughly eliminate odors here. Every winter, the excellent heat retention effect of graphene is fully demonstrated, allowing people to feel exceptional warmth and comfort. In addition to using graphene material, what's more important is that it also has excellent deodorizing functionality. Therefore, these easy-fit socks are truly special. Have you tried them on? Have you ever used a quilt made of graphene material? I haven't yet. However, just gently covering it over your legs lets you immediately feel the warmth. I have a graphene blanket myself, and as soon as I put it on, I can instantly feel the heat. Hearing you say that, I also have a blanket specially for covering my legs. That's right, many thanks to them for their support, and I also want to express my sincerest gratitude to all our audience friends. The topic we are going to discuss today is the latest version quietly released online by the United States last Friday, during the late-night hours U.S. time, known as the Trump 2.0 U.S. National Security Strategy. This news immediately caused a sensation around the world and triggered an intense wave of discussion. It is indeed a highly dramatic and significant development. If you simply read the 33 pages of text in this document, you might only vaguely sense that there are some slight differences from before. However, only through continuous comparison can you truly see the changes and distinctions within it. When you compare it with Trump's current approach, it becomes clear that the era of American hegemony we spoke of has indeed come to an end, and this conclusion has been personally confirmed by Trump himself. The reason we chose such a title is that it clearly shows that it actually reveals a fact to everyone. Since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been pursuing a position of global hegemony. In the 1990s, the United States achieved its strategic goal of establishing global hegemony. Since then, it has entered an era of globalism centered on promoting its own values worldwide. Amid this wave of globalism, anyone who holds an ideology different from mine is regarded as an enemy, a villain, or even labeled a rogue. Therefore, as long as someone differs from me in ideology or way of governance, I will demand that they make a change. In the past, when the United States promoted its values around the world, it adopted various means, whether a conciliatory carrot or a hard stick, and most of the time relied on forceful measures. Today, this model of value export has come to an end and has been brought to a close. In this National Security Strategy, NSS, report, the United States has completely abandoned its previous strategic thinking, no longer emphasizing value orientation, and therefore no longer stressing so-called value-based allies. Today, allies hold only instrumental significance, and the United States no longer plays the role of the world's policeman. The United States has retreated to the Western Hemisphere, focusing on playing the role of hegemon in that region, and this hegemony is now more concentrated among the countries of the Americas. Therefore, the United States has been frequently exerting pressure among the countries of the Americas, whether through economic means or through its current actions off the coast of Venezuela, all demonstrating the same tough stance. In the Americas, the United States is actually returning to the discourse proposed by Trump of going back to the Monroe Doctrine. As for the European countries, this can be seen as a major strategic retreat since the Marshall Plan, with the United States no longer emphasizing its alliance with Europe. By contrast, the United States no longer regards protecting Europe as its primary goal, but instead calls on European countries to confront and take responsibility for their own security. Europe must face and deal with its own hostile forces on its own. In dealing with the situation in Asia, he hopes, ideally, to contain China's ambitions to dominate the region. However, he no longer regards China as the primary threat, nor does he define it as the most serious challenge or main competitor. By contrast, he has redefined China's role on three levels. First, as an economic competitor. Second, as a main source of supply chain vulnerabilities, which is why he must focus on strengthening U.S. manufacturing. The third aspect is that, ideally, China should be prevented from gaining dominance over the entire Asia-Pacific region. However, in this ideal scenario, allies would have to take on greater responsibilities, and their relationships with the United States would gradually become less close. If one reads the entire text and examines it in the context of the evolution of U.S. strategy after World War II, it becomes clear that this shift can be described as an extremely drastic turn. This change will have a profound impact on countries and regions around the world, and Taiwan will undoubtedly bear the brunt. Therefore, how we view the current situation is at a critical moment. Next, in the second part, we will explore the relationships among the United States, China, and Japan. Recently, several important events have occurred in this regard. On one hand, after U.S. Senator Sinai Gauze delivered a congressional speech on November 7th, Japan's domestic stance toward China-Japan relations grew increasingly tense, leading to a continued escalation of conflicts between the two countries. Japan's current sense of anxiety is deepening, as it is almost impossible to find anyone in the U.S. political and public spheres willing to support Japan, which has caused its concerns to keep escalating. After SiSTeCATI delivered that speech in the National Diet, tensions and conflicts between China and Japan continued to escalate. At the same time, Japan's anxiety grew day by day because hardly anyone in the United States was willing to support them. As this incident deepened Japan's growing anxiety, the Financial Times also published a special report conveying this sense of unease. However, Japan's weekly Bunshun revealed that during a phone call with SiSTeCATI, Trump spoke in a very firm tone, almost to the point of directly reprimanding her. This is information revealed by Japanese domestic media. Therefore, how to view the increasingly tense situation between China and Japan has become a question worth serious consideration. Recently, on Saturday, two Japanese F-15 fighter jets were locked on by the radar of Chinese mainland J-15 fighter jets. This is undoubtedly a highly provocative move. The incident occurred on the high seas southeast of Okinawa. The Chinese mainland claims that Japan interfered with its military exercises, while Japan considers this an act of provocation against the country. At a time when the United States is trying to play down the tensions between China and Japan, how should the outside world view the current strained state of China-Japan relations? In addition, we also saw French President Macron visiting mainland China, while Russian President Putin went to India for a visit. What signals about changes in the international strategic landscape do these two sets of diplomatic interactions convey to the world? However, let's start with the United States' latest national security strategy, which is 33 pages long. I would describe it this way. For quite some time, the global situation could be called a Pax Americana. G means the governance in the word govern, and sure refers to the world in the word world. The entire world is under the governance of the United States and is required to follow a set of common values. Those who do not adopt these shared values are regarded as enemies of all. This incident has caused China, U.S. relations and U.S. Russia relations to remain increasingly tense. However, Trump declared that the era of this established system has ended. His remarks sounded as if the United States were announcing a ranking, defining how each country would be positioned in its relations with it from now on. First of all, we can see that this is a Trump 2.0 national security strategy report centered on the United States' own interests and shaped by its subjective worldview. This national security strategy report has been issued under every U.S. leader. For quite a long period after the end of the Cold War, the United States dominated the global situation with absolute superiority. Therefore, regardless of who is in power, U.S. policy has always maintained a certain degree of consistency. although this consistency may still show some differences at the domestic level. However, in the international community, the United States has consistently engaged in pervasive global intervention. Such intervention is not only evident when its own interests are involved, but it may also intervene whenever anything displeases the U.S. or runs counter to its values. I remember during the Clinton administration, he once said a famous line, "What are universal values? American values are universal values." Therefore, as long as the United States considers certain actions to be inconsistent with its standards of values, it will use that as the basis to define other countries' positions, and those that maintain cooperation with it are regarded as allies based on shared values. Therefore, we can see that 2 democracy summits were held during Biden's term, clearly demonstrating that the word democracy occupies a highly significant place in his diplomatic and policy thinking. At that time, Taiwan's Audrey Tang participated in the meeting via video link and was given the title of democracy, as if symbolizing being crowned by the United States. However, what I want to say is that from today onward, do not use these 2 words to mock or provoke Trump anymore. Trump made it clear that these things are not important, let alone other countries. Even the kind of system your own nation adopts has nothing to do with him. He now intends to repair relations with Russia, so how should Europe handle itself? It can only find its own way. He is in fierce strategic competition with China, so how should the neighboring countries respond? You have to find a way to solve this problem yourself. But you must understand that throughout the entire 33-page document, his focus and emphasis on Russia and China are consistent, with his attention to China being even more pronounced. Therefore, whether you understand democracy or not has little relevance to him. You can even clearly sense that his core strategic focus is on the so-called core strategic area, namely, the Western Hemisphere. He has already shifted from globalism to hemispherism. This is the first obvious change. He now emphasizes only a hemispheric perspective and no longer talks about a global view. Globalism has been an idea that the United States has repeatedly emphasized for decades, constantly saying global, global, global. Yet now, what he speaks of is hemispherism, focusing on the Western Hemisphere. He is working to strengthen the power of the entire Western Hemisphere, and within this region, the core idea is the Monroe Doctrine of the Americas. In the Americas, regardless of whether you practice a democratic system, as long as he wants to put pressure on you, he will definitely take action. This has nothing to do with your political system. Even a government elected through democratic elections can be accused of fraud if he is dissatisfied. That's right. So now you can see that whether it's his involvement in Argentina, his interference in the situation in Honduras, or his scornful yet confident attitude toward Canada to the north, it's as if he's convinced the other side will sooner or later become part of his sphere of influence. He is now preparing to take action against Venezuela, showing a tough and aggressive stance toward neighboring Colombia, at the same time issuing warnings to Panama and continuing the blockade and containment of Cuba. Even regarding Nicaragua and tariff policies, he has demonstrated oppressive methods. Because Bolsonaro's approval rating in Brazil is about 50%, you can understand that as long as he remains in power, he has in fact already begun to take action. Throughout Latin America, he has no intention of reasoning with anyone. Your systems, institutions, or anything else no longer matter. The key point is that you all belong to his sphere of influence and are at the core of his interests. That region is precisely his strategic core area. The Western Hemisphere belongs to him and must always remain under his influence. For the United States, retreating from a global deployment to maintaining influence only within a hemispheric scope constitutes a profoundly significant strategic withdrawal. So, what kind of situation will unfold in the hemisphere vacated by the United States? How exactly is the United States thinking about this change? This point itself may not be important, but within the context of this hemispheric doctrine, it's easy to feel strongly about the 33-page report proposed by Trump, thinking that it is, in fact, a strategic retreat. From the U.S. perspective, this should be seen as a strategic rebalancing under limited resources. It is, in fact, a process of strategic rebalancing that reflects how the United States is adjusting according to its existing resources and national. With that 33-page report, Trump essentially confirmed and publicly declared that the United States no longer has the national strength to support the globalism he advocates. In the past, the design of the U.S. military force had a clear standard. It had to possess the capability to reach any location in the world within 24 hours. In other words, the U.S. military could project the strength of a division to any corner of the globe within a single day to maintain its global military presence and influence. Today, the United States is no longer able to project its military power to every corner of the world, not to mention the possibility of conflicts with other nations. Merely maintaining such a global operational capability has already become a heavy burden for the United States itself. Therefore, he began to show signs of retreat. Although this could be seen as a strategic rebalancing, from our perspective, it looks more like the final glimmer of an empire on the eve of its decline. This is actually a kind of final radiance before decline. After delivering his speech, Trump seemed to regain his confidence and vitality, looking spirited and energetic, as if he had suddenly taken an elixir and was reinvigorated once again. I said that there have been a total of 24 dynasties in Chinese history, of which at least 15 are well known and can be clearly counted by people. When a dynasty enters roughly the first third of its mid to late stage, a leader similar to Trump often emerges. He realizes that if no drastic, do-or-die reform is carried out at this point, the entire dynasty will head toward ruin and may even come to an end in his hands. Therefore, we often confer upon such monarchs the title of a reviver of the dynasty, and in history, there have been at least 15 such cases. What I want to say is that these leaders who emerged in the mid to late stages of a dynasty, embodying a kind of fleeting resurgence, all share certain common traits. First, their terms of rule were often relatively short. Secondly, the appeals of these leaders were usually very clear. They emphasized making every effort to govern effectively, implementing bold reforms, resolving to fight to the end, and promoting change in both domestic and foreign affairs. However, once he ended his rule, there was often no capable successor, and the decline of the dynasty actually accelerated. Almost all such situations followed the same trajectory. The United States under Trump today actually resembles Britain around 1945, and this similarity is even more pronounced. In other words, Britain at that time had also made efforts and put forward propositions similar to those of Trump. You will find that the reason Churchill was unable to continue governing after the end of World War II was that he made the British people feel bleak about the future and lacking in hope. Therefore, after the end of World War II, Churchill was no longer able to continue leading the country and was eventually voted out by the British people. At that time, Britain also gradually realized that its strength was no longer what it used to be. However, it was not until Mrs. Thatcher came to power, a leader who was likewise extremely conservative, that she made it clear to the British people during her campaign that the former glory could no longer be regained. Britain's former era as the empire on which the sun never set has long become history. As for Trump, he has not yet reached the stage that Mrs. Thatcher once did and is still struggling at present. What Trump represents is actually the glory and superior status of the United States as an imperial hegemon, as well as a long-standing mentality of standing above others on the international stage. This reliance on power and habit of seizing wealth through cunning and force has, over time, become deeply ingrained. He is now striving to guard every dish on his table, but in the end, he will realize that such maintenance cannot last long. What is called a final burst of brilliance is merely a fleeting moment after all. The so-called strategic rebalance is ultimately just a subjective illusion of the United States. In the future, other leaders will show the world that even the kind of hemispheric doctrine Trump tried to build is difficult to achieve. If the United States wants to carry out unconditional and comprehensive intervention and control over the Latin American region, it simply will not work. You see, the America of today is no longer the one that had great influence before and after World War II. In the 35 years since the end of the Cold War, for roughly more than 20 of them, Almost all of the United States' annual increases in defense budget and military strength have been concentrated in one place, the Seventh Fleet. These military forces are mainly deployed along the First Island chain. Most of his armed forces are concentrated here. Therefore, those so-called deployments, such as the fleet in the Caribbean Sea, are in fact fleets in name only. The so-called Fourth Fleet exists merely nominally, with neither warships nor aircraft carriers. However, since the Trump 2.0 era, the only fleet he has significantly strengthened is the Caribbean Fleet. This also shows that he had actually begun taking action long ago. What you are seeing right now is the Monroe Doctrine of the Americas coming back into play. That's right, the United States has already begun to act. As for those small neighboring countries, of course they feel intimidated. After all, whose fist could possibly be harder than theirs? That is impossible. Therefore, Trump is currently working to integrate the United States' existing resources, attempting to gather and concentrate its dispersed forces so that, if necessary, all military power can be mobilized for a final confrontation, while also waiting for an opportunity to rise again. Alright, regarding the center concept mentioned earlier, although I don't like interpreting Trump from the perspective that he supposedly wants to become the center, I believe Trump is a thorough realist, so he no longer emphasizes the so-called alliance of values. For quite a long period of time, strictly speaking, for more than 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the United States has carried out various forms of global intervention in the name of a values alliance. Well, at least Trump saw reality clearly. After realizing that America's hegemony was no longer as stable as it once was, he chose to readjust and pull back all resources to cope with the new situation. So, where were these resources redirected? Mainly toward Latin America, that is, the entire Americas region. Throughout the report, he actually mentioned a concept that large contract tenders in Latin American countries should preferably, or even directly, be awarded to American companies. In other words, these contracts no longer need to go through bidding. American companies will automatically receive the tenders and directly take on the related work. From this perspective, it becomes clear why Trump inevitably sought to support close allies in becoming presidents across the countries of the Americas. This is inevitable, because only when his allies serve as president can it be ensured that American corporations can reap huge profits and amass vast wealth. As long as your country stands on the same side as mine, I will fully support you. No matter what you propose, I will have your back. Then, in the case of Honduras, he pardoned a man who had previously been accused by the United States of being a drug trafficker, Yedrins. Through this approach, he intervened in almost every. Next year, 6 countries in Latin America will hold presidential elections. At the strategic level, he made it clear that his approach is based on President Theodore Roosevelt's Monroe Doctrine, reinforced and extended through Trump's strategic thinking. Therefore, he will not completely follow Trump-style reasoning based on Theodore Roosevelt's interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. Instead, I adopt what I call Trump-style reasoning. That is, I decide for myself what Theodore Roosevelt might have done if he were still alive. This actually reflects that I still see myself as a hegemon on the international stage. Perhaps I cannot be called a true overlord on a global scale, but if I shift my focus back to the Americas, I remain an unshakable superpower, able to continually draw resources from weaker nations. This approach is somewhat like performing the Great Star Absorbing technique. Do you think the Great Star Absorbing technique is meant to deal with those who are highly skilled in martial arts? No, of course not. It must be used against the weak, because when facing the strong, first, you may not succeed. Second, even if you absorb their power, you might not be able to control it. Therefore, such an action is only feasible when directed at the weak or weaker nations. Therefore, returning to the Americas to re-establish dominance actually also means withdrawing from Europe. While dominating in the Americas, one is simultaneously retreating in Europe. He even tried to support far-right parties in Europe, and thus leveled many criticisms against Europe, accusing them of violating the principles of civilization and continually relaxing policies to allow large numbers of immigrants to pour in. Those far-right parties that oppose immigration have been suppressed by the mainstream forces. He believes that Europe is the one truly opposed to civilization, because in his view, immigrants themselves represent a lack of civilization. Therefore, in his view, only opposing immigration is the true expression of civilization. At the same time, he also demands that Europe take full military responsibility. In fact, reports have already indicated that Trump has threatened to completely withdraw troops in 2027. They will no longer undertake any military commitments in Europe. However, I am not sure what exactly the so-called complete withdrawal means. Does it mean that all those U.S. military bases spread across Europe will also be pulled out? For the countries of Europe, the war in Ukraine has not yet truly ended. But at this moment, the United States has already begun to openly discuss rebuilding strategic stability and reshaping relations with Russia. In other words, he is already preparing to rebuild a strategically stable relationship with Russia. So for those European countries that regard Russia as an enemy, how should they handle themselves next? At the same time, Trump has been supporting far-right parties within these countries, further influencing their political landscape. And the way they responded to external threats was by choosing to retreat, while shaking hands with their opponents and turning enemies into friends. This is precisely the source of Europe's current, inevitable anxiety. Interestingly, after various analyses and discussions, the European media ultimately reached a consensus. The most important thing for now is still to first appease Trump. Next, let us turn our attention to the Middle East. For quite some time, and even more noticeably during Biden's presidency, though similar approaches could already be seen in the Obama era, the region has been the focus of efforts to emphasize the so-called democratic alliance. Therefore, many countries in the Middle East actually adopt a monarchical system of governance. Therefore, the so-called Arab Spring movements that emerged during the 2010s were in fact significantly driven and influenced by American power behind the scenes. In other words, their goal was to establish a nation in the region that embodied the values of democracy, freedom, and human rights. If the other side failed to meet these demands, they would resort to force. This was precisely the reason George W. Bush decided to invade Iraq. Therefore, during his presidency, Obama actively supported and assisted the development of the entire Arab Spring movement. By the time of Biden's administration, he even criticized the Saudi crown prince for allegedly murdering Khashoggi and described the country as a pariah state. That's roughly how the situation stood. Trump explicitly stated that this matter no longer exists. In the Middle East, he emphasized economic partnership and cooperation rather than focusing on the so-called alliance of democratic values. It is no longer possible for me to carry out any actions to overthrow other countries' regimes in the name of democracy. I believe that many countries in the Middle East welcome such a change. However, Israel was only briefly mentioned throughout the issue. By comparison, the content related to the Middle East was quite limited. In the end, we shifted our focus back to Asia, the region most closely connected to us. Trump redefined China. Such a redefinition carries great significance for mainland China, because whether it concerns an individual, an institution, or a nation, characterization is an extremely important matter. For the United States, isn't the situation quite the same? Since the time of George W. Bush, the term rogue state has emerged with the purpose of demonizing certain countries. They plan to redefine many countries, and during the Trump 1.0 era, the characterization of mainland China was particularly harsh, being regarded as the most significant threat. Subsequently, the wording they used continued to evolve, including expressions such as primary threat, most severe challenge, and main benchmarking target. This time, regarding the parts related to mainland China, I think major media outlets including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal generally believe that the U.S. side's wording toward China has clearly become more moderate, because they no longer emphasize statements such as primary threat, toughest challenge, or main rival, but instead have shifted the focus of competition entirely to the economic domain. It is regarded as the primary economic competitor and also an important rival in the field of supply chains. Once problems arise in the supply chain, mainland China, with its comprehensive and massive manufacturing system, becomes a key factor. Any country with tense relations with mainland China may face the risk of supply chain disruption. Therefore, mainland China is also seen as a potential threat to supply chains. The third part is closely and significantly related to Taiwan. The expression used in it is that, ideally, mainland China should be prevented from gaining dominance in the region. It follows the principle of power, demonstrating and practicing this principle by maintaining military superiority. However, the document also issued a warning. If allies in the first island chain fail to commit more resources and take more concrete actions, the future balance of forces could become highly unfavorable to the United States, and it might even make the defense of Taiwan impossible. In fact, when I read this passage, I wanted to remind everyone that a historian named Foxon has repeatedly emphasized that the United States must never give up defending Taiwan. If the United States does not cooperate in its defense or protect Taiwan, it could lose trust and support within its system of international allies. Once credibility is lost, trust cannot be rebuilt. If we are not even willing to defend Taiwan, the warning in this document is in fact sending a message to all allies. Whether Taiwan's status can be maintained is no longer my concern. This has become a shared responsibility among the allies of the first island chain. Therefore, Japan and South Korea are currently feeling quite anxious. South Korea said, "If I am to help you defend Taiwan, then how should I handle my relationship with mainland China?" Therefore, South Korea is currently holding intensive internal meetings and discussions on this new positioning. At present, Japan has come into direct conflict with mainland China, but the United States has not expressed support for Japan either in words or in writing, leaving Japan to wonder, what should I do? Perhaps the most endearing thing about Taiwan is that we bury our heads in the sand like ostriches while telling everyone, thanks to the United States, Taiwan's status has been elevated. How wonderful. The year 2025 is drawing to a close, and it will ultimately be regarded as the 15th year of Wanli in human and American history, symbolizing the beginning of America's future decline. During this year, you can see the strategic report he presented. During the weekend, I watched some videos and talk shows from both the East and the West, and from their tone, I could clearly sense an extremely misguided atmosphere. The kind of misguided atmosphere I was referring to means that most people feel uneasy and are worried about where we should go amid the drastic changes in the United States. That tone is actually a bit like what our proverb says. It is hard to portray the bones when painting a dragon or a tiger. One can know a person's face but not their heart. Imposing on the surface, but hollow underneath. You usually hope to see America decline, thinking it too domineering. But when America suddenly recognizes its own limits and chooses not to intervene anymore, you become anxious and tense, repeatedly asking, what should we do? What should we do? What should we do? This day will eventually come. It is indeed a tremendous opportunity, and the window of opportunity opens from this moment. From here on, everyone must find their own way forward, advancing by their own abilities. America's retreat today is not born of a moral awakening. In the past, these allied countries, including Taiwan, often liked to use moral coercion to demand that the United States uphold its so-called credibility. But this so-called credibility actually stems from America's ongoing effort to promote what it calls a liberal values alliance. This kind of values alliance, centered on liberalism and democratic politics, makes anyone who stands side by side with the United States seem to have a halo placed over their head. That kind of halo symbolizes a sense of self-perceived superiority, as if standing atop the world as the most exceptional of humankind. However, Trump no longer caters to this narrative, because he can no longer keep playing this role. I said the reason he stopped acting was that he could no longer keep pretending. His betrayal was not a matter of choice, but of helplessness. After all, every sense of loyalty and integrity ultimately needs strength to sustain it. When I don't have enough strength, what else can I do? You only need to look at the contents of this report, and you'll find that at the beginning there is a short passage that is a presidential address delivered by Trump in the first person. In his address, he told the American people that this document is intended to serve as a blueprint for the United States' development over the coming decades, ensuring that it remains the strongest, wealthiest, most influential, and most successful nation in human history. Every leader speaks in this way. It does no harm to let them chant their slogans. However, to achieve this goal, our country must formulate a coherent and focused strategy to properly handle its interactions with the world. The core objective of the United States foreign policy is solely to safeguard and defend its fundamental national interests. No matter how valuable other countries, regions, or undertakings may be, if they cannot directly serve the core interests of the United States, they cannot become the focus of U.S. strategy. The principle is that simple. No matter how wealthy or chaotic your family is, or if it is in poverty and famine, these are all your own affairs. Unless this matter has a very direct connection to me, you don't need to keep your eyes on the United States, expecting it to step in and save the day. This point has already been made quite clear in his guidelines. Taiwan must thoroughly understand Trump's initial remarks, and Japan should likewise fully grasp their implications. In the past, many allies believed that as long as they stood by the United States, they would gain a sense of security and bask in the aura of democracy and freedom. However, Trump no longer talks about these ideals, instead explicitly emphasizing the core interest of America first. His stance is simple and direct. Those whose interests align can coexist, while those whose interests conflict are excluded. As for what kind of political systems each side has, it no longer bears any relation to this interest-based orientation. So what is Trump's position? From Trump's various statements, it is also evident that his attitude toward other countries revolves around a central idea. He has adopted an Atlantic-centered hemispheric mindset, regarding this as America's core strategic region. Take the Middle East as an example. The region has clearly been downgraded strategically. Trump specifically emphasized that as long as resources such as oil in the Middle East are not completely controlled by hostile nations, the United States will no longer regard this area as a primary strategic focus. In Middle Eastern affairs, Trump primarily promoted peaceful coexistence between various countries and Israel through the Abraham Accords. In this way, Israel's situation became more stable, and its strength was sufficient to help the United States maintain balance and oversight in the Middle East. As long as the Middle East's resources do not fall into the hands of rivals, its strategic importance will naturally be relatively downgraded. Even worse, some countries were almost completely ignored in the report, indicating that they have been marginalized at the strategic level. For example, Trump hardly mentioned India, Pakistan, and Africa. Even regions we consider highly important, such as New Zealand, Australia, and the South Pacific, received little attention. Because he carried out a major strategic retreat in the Pacific direction, although he still referred to the first island chain, you will find that the South Pacific has been completely ignored. Therefore, those regions that Taiwan once regarded as extremely important have now been relatively downgraded in his strategy. He plans to significantly reduce the deployment of naval forces in the Pacific region, pull back, and retain only the forces sufficient to maintain a certain strategic balance with China in that area. He does not intend to establish absolute superiority in the Pacific. This is an issue that the entire first island chain, including Japan and South Korea, must pay special attention to. As for Japan, we will discuss that further later. When discussing South Korea, the first thing to note is that this report does not mention North Korea at all. North Korea has disappeared. In the past, it was a target that the United States, Japan, and South Korea worked hard to contain and guard against, even prompting the U.S. to send a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to demonstrate right at its doorstep. As early as 2021, Biden even sent in the SEALs to land, apparently preparing to carry out some special missions unknown to the outside world. I believe he intended to carry out a decapitation operation at the time, trying to escalate the situation, but it ultimately ended in failure. Alright, but in this report, North Korea has completely disappeared, not even a single mention of it. In other words, his way of thinking has completely changed and is now entirely different from what you consider important, as well as from the things he used to claim he cared about. Now, here in Taiwan, we can see that the Taiwanese side is still trying to mislead the public in various ways, claiming that Trump's commitments to Taiwan remain valid. Indeed, he did mention Taiwan in his speech, about 8 times in total. Mentioning it 8 times is indeed quite a lot. This not only highlights the urgency of Taiwan's security issue, but also shows that as the world's semiconductor production remains highly concentrated in Taiwan, it naturally holds great importance for him. There is no doubt that this is precisely where the United States' core interests still lie. The point I'm making is not the institutional or other differences between you and him, but whether his core interests have been touched. Semiconductors are precisely his most crucial core interest. I even believe that TSMC's importance far exceeds that of all Taiwan. What he cares about is TSMC, while what Japan cares about is the whole of Taiwan. There is a significant difference between the two. The former focuses on considerations at the global technological level, while the latter concentrates on issues of geopolitical strategy. Once the United States can take hold of the key parts of TSMC itself, as Lai Ching-te mentioned, the production and profits of chips can each be split in half. If a situation truly arises where chip production is split evenly, when the United States no longer depends on chips, Taiwan's position will inevitably undergo major changes. The United States' strategic position is retreating, creating a huge strategic vacuum that seems to be handed over to China for nothing. No, what I mean is, what we need to pay attention to next is that what the United States does not want does not necessarily mean that China will want it. If the United States retreats to its own hemisphere, it does not mean that China will inevitably take over the territory of the other hemisphere. From a character perspective, China is not essentially like that. The United States chooses to safeguard its own hemisphere, viewing that region as a strategic core, one of the key points in Trump's national security strategy, NSS. However, this does not mean that China will regard the other hemisphere entirely as its own sphere of influence, because China does not operate in that manner. Therefore, it is America's own decision to no longer be the world's leader. Even if the United States does not wish to be second, that too is its own affair. However, China has no intention of replacing it or becoming the new leader. China's national character differs greatly from the Western hegemonism represented by the United States. Look, even when facing countries like India and Pakistan, from the perspective of all of Asia, wasn't that so-called Indo-Pacific alliance once promoted with such fanfare? Is Japan important? Is Australia important? For him, when he adopts a hemispheric stance, these countries are regarded as lying outside his hemisphere. He has almost never mentioned those countries that lie beyond his hemisphere, let alone those that are not part of his strategic layout at all. To him, whether you exist or not makes no difference to the overall situation. Small countries in the South Pacific, and even ASEAN member states and the Philippines, all fall within this scope. The Philippines considers itself very important, but it might be worth taking a closer look. As for Taiwan, it still has a key industry like TSMC. So what about the Philippines? What can you bring to the table? In other words, judging from this report, I think South Korea may not yet truly understand him. Because South Korea still holds some bargaining chips after all, but what about the Philippines? What leverage do you have for negotiation? As for Africa, there's hardly any need to elaborate. Aside from its abundant resources, it offers the United States almost no other attraction. The American president I'm referring to doesn't even bother to set foot in Africa. Therefore, in the future global development landscape, if we look back at past circumstances, we can discern its underlying patterns and changes. If in the past we viewed the entire world entirely from the American perspective, then the era of globalism has already come to an end. Today, differences in strategic value across various regions of the world are re-emerging, and the importance of strategy is once again taking on clear levels and hierarchies. As a result, many regions have been downgraded or marginalized, while what has truly been highlighted and valued are Latin America and the Atlantic region centered on the United States, whose strategic and economic interests have become the new focus. He will still value NATO, but because of the special relationship with Russia, his attention to Russia will surpass his concern for NATO. Therefore, at present, throughout the entire European system, NATO member states generally feel anxious and uneasy. You said that people in NATO countries are panicking, but in my view, the countries in Asia are likewise in a state of worry and unease. Moreover, the closer a country is to the United States, especially those that have drawn nearer to it during Biden's presidency, the more uneasy and unsettled they now feel. As for South Korea, due to the influence of Lee Jae-myung, the situation is relatively stable and does not appear as anxious. However, in this report, which calls on South Korea to take on alliance responsibilities for defending the first island chain, South Korea will clearly make different considerations and trade-offs based on its own position and interests. Because this strategic report makes no mention at all of North Korea's position. However, For South Korea, the only major threat at present comes from North Korea. It is impossible for them to regard mainland China as the main rival. If South Korea regards mainland China as an enemy, then it will be unable to deal simultaneously with the threat from North Korea. Therefore, South Korea cannot fully align with the United States on this point. Therefore, when the United States specifically calls on South Korea to play the role of an ally, it is foreseeable that this will be difficult to realize, and in the end, the only country it can truly rely on is Japan.
As for Japan, we will discuss it later. At present, some subtle yet noteworthy new developments are emerging in the relationships among China, the United States, and Japan, as well as among China, Japan, and Russia.
As for Taiwan, we are a closed community that finds it relatively difficult to face reality. Therefore, you will find that both Lai Ching-te and Lin Xiaolong have expressed their gratitude to the U.S. government. Even Su Tsian stated that this report shows the United States has made its strategic stance on its Taiwan policy clearer and will be fully committed to assisting in Taiwan's defense. May I ask, exactly which sentence did you see the words assist in defending Taiwan in? Where did you see that? Almost all the comments believe that this event reflects how U.S.-Taiwan relations have been reduced to a simplified version focused solely on semiconductor interests. As a result, some people interpreted this as an important sign of the United States' defense commitment to Taiwan. I then realized that it is indeed quite difficult for Taiwan to face reality. The perspectives of Professor Su Chi and Su Tsian precisely illustrate this difference. I'm referring to Professor Su Chi. After reading the report yesterday, he specially sent you a message. He and I had a brief discussion, and afterward he sent me some materials. He said that besides reading this NSS, you must also consult another report. Only by looking at both together will you get the complete picture. He sent me that material. The report is Strategy 2025, released this year by the U.S. Pacific Marine Corps. These kinds of issues are rarely part of our usual discussions. Although it sounds quite militaristic, he said that after reading this report, you would understand the U.S. approach toward Taiwan. He mentioned that since we have just dispatched a reinforced Marine battalion to Guam to conduct joint exercises with the U.S. side, this move is particularly meaningful. We all know that the United States has reorganized its Marine Corps forces in the Western Pacific into Marine Littoral Regiments, adopting a strategic deployment model that stations units dispersed across various small islands. In addition, each island unit must be capable of independently sustaining itself and carrying out combat missions locally. This may sound quite impressive, but according to the Marine Corps' 2025 report, the U.S. military strategic focus in Asia is actually on establishing an expeditionary base operational model. However, they must rely on their own prepared construction materials, supplies, equipment, and ammunition to independently resist the PLA on islands lacking any external support. In addition, the report's assessment indicates that these Marine units will play a crucial role in the first wave of combat operations, as the U.S. Marine Corps is regarded as its primary and representative combat force. The report pointed out that if the first wave of combat breaks out with the People's Liberation Army, the Marine Corps' casualty rate could reach as high as 30% to 50%. The report indicated that if forces survive for about 3 days during the first wave of operations, the casualty rate in the second wave of combat could rise to 70%. In addition, the loss rate of systems such as small vessels and unmanned ships is estimated to reach as high as 60% to 80%. The drone ground control stations deployed on the islands have an average survival time of only 2 to 5. Within the first 2 to 5 hours after the start of combat, all drone and unmanned vessel command and operation systems on the islands will be completely destroyed. He pointed out that the situation is the same on every island. If the operation is of a short-term nature, meaning that Taiwan cannot hold out for long and the situation quickly comes to an end, the conflict will conclude within a short period of time. He predicted that during a short-term operation, the number of U.S. military fatalities in the first clash with the People's Liberation Army could reach 30 to 50,000. He stated that if Taiwan were unexpectedly able to hold out for a longer period, the estimated death toll would rise to between 80,000 and 120,000. He pointed out that given such a time window and casualty ratio, it would be impossible for the U.S. military to launch an attack, and in fact, there would be no operational feasibility. Therefore, he stated that after the U.S. military lost more than 50% of its combat power, it would be impossible to continue fighting. At that point, all the forces on the island, regardless of their affiliation, would choose to surrender, and Taiwan would no longer be able to hold out. What he mentioned was another report that Suu Kyi handed to me yesterday. Although I did not print out that report, its contents are exactly the same as the one mentioned earlier. Once a military conflict breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. assessment holds that Taiwan must possess the capability to independently sustain combat operations for at least 2 months. Only if Taiwan can hold out for 2 months will the United States have reason and justification to assess whether to undertake military intervention. If it cannot hold out for 2 months, then discussions of military intervention are meaningless. However, all assessment results indicate that Taiwan simply cannot sustain itself for 2 months, let alone 2 months. Most estimates are based on 3 days to a week. From this estimation, if the war lasts for 3 days to a week, the Marine Corps' forces will be depleted by about 70 to 80%. Such an operation is simply impossible to carry out. Therefore, no matter what you hear from Lai Ching-te, Lin Qialong, or Su Sengchong, I feel sympathy for them, because I understand that they have no choice but to express themselves in that way. All the remarks sound like holding a funeral in the tone of a celebration. To put it bluntly, they are forcing their own words to become someone else's meaning. Nowadays, Japan is doing the same, all claiming that Trump's meaning is actually their own. However, reality always ends up slapping you in the face afterward. You'll find that Trump now shows almost no interest in matters related to the first island chain. Whether it's the current military exercises being carried out by the PLA or the recent tensions between China and Japan, has Trump made any statements about them? Aside from having one phone call with him, Trump has not said another unnecessary word. Has the State Department made any statements? Likewise, not a single extra word. So, has any substantive military resource been provided? Not at all. Therefore, if Taiwan is still motivated by electoral considerations at this point and tries to tell the public, the United States listens to us, just look at this report, that would be far too naive. When you read this report, you absolutely cannot interpret any concrete meaning from it. On the contrary, precisely because both the United States and China are striving to avoid war, if Taiwan were to become the side that could trigger conflict in cross-strait relations, then, in fact, long before Trump's report, we had already mentioned many times on the program this year that I believe the current U.S. strategic position toward Taiwan is never to allow the mainland to have any reason for misjudgment or for being forced to take action against Taiwan. If the mainland loses confidence in peacefully unifying Taiwan and believes that a peaceful resolution is no longer possible, it means that the United States' overall strategy has already failed. However, judging from Lai Ching-te's current approach, the mainland side has even deleted his account on Xiaohongshu. The mainland's confidence in peacefully unifying Taiwan has been steadily weakening, which will lead to a fundamental contradiction between the United States' strategy and Lai Ching-te's own tactics, making it difficult for him to gain U.S. support. The death tolls you just mentioned start at least at 20 or 30,000, right? I just looked it up briefly, and the United States' 20 years in the war in Afghanistan are widely regarded as a complete failure, with the number of deaths during that period being quite shocking. I'm telling you, the total number of deaths among U.S. forces over 20 years, including contractors, did not exceed 6,000, with the number of regular U.S. military personnel ranging between about 2,100 and 2,500. However, a portion of them were so-called contractors, whose death toll reached 3,917. Faced with such a number of deaths, the United States considered the war a failure because they could not bear such a heavy cost in casualties. Then do you think that if a war really breaks out across the Taiwan Strait, according to the assessments of the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Command, the death toll will reach 20 to 30,000 people? I thought, alright. Feng Qing just mentioned using the Afghanistan War or the Iraq War for comparison, but such a comparison isn't accurate, because the two are simply not on the same level. During the Korean War, U.S. casualties exceeded 30,000. In the Vietnam War, the number of American deaths reached more than 50,000. The losses from the Vietnam War had already become unbearable for the United States. During World War II, the United States fought Japan in the Pacific Theater for a very long time. In the end, the United States ended the war with 2 atomic bombs. Throughout the entire Pacific Theater, American forces displayed extraordinary bravery, but also paid a heavy price, with casualties reaching 200,000. On the European battlefield, you can see U.S. forces launching the Normandy landings, while General Patton led the British, French, and other Allied troops in a counteroffensive, engaging in fierce combat with the German army. The number of U.S. casualties in the European theater reached 200,000. I'm not saying that 200,000 people is a small number, but compared to the 2 world wars, there were 200,000 casualties in the Pacific theater and the same number in the European theater. Do you think the United States would be willing, in a Taiwan conflict, to risk losing 80,000 to 120,000 modern Marine Corps personnel in just 1 week? His assessment here only concerns the Marine Corps. Could such a situation really happen? That is impossible. I believe that when having any professional discussion with the public, one should remain honest. Otherwise, the people of Taiwan will not be able to truly understand the content of this strategic report. What kind of impact will Trump's national security strategy, NSS, ultimately have on Taiwan? Alright, next let's take a look at the latest developments between China and Japan. In fact, over the weekend, another incident took place in international waters southeast of Okinawa. That area lies on the high seas, and it happens to be the site of mainland China's military exercises. Next, a Japan Self-Defense Forces F-15 fighter jet, while flying over international waters southeast of Okinawa's main island, was locked onto by the radar of a J-15 fighter jet that had taken off from China's aircraft carrier Liaoning. The incident occurred twice, the first time between 4:32 p.m. and 4:35 p.m., and then a second time between 6:37 p.m. and 7:08 p.m. In response, the Japanese side expressed a strong protest, with both Defense Minister Koizumi Jinzaburo and Prime Minister SiSTeCATI lodging stern objections to the incident. However, mainland China refuted this, stating that the area is part of their air exercise zone, and pointed out that Japanese fighter jets have been continuously approaching their training airspace, causing disruptions to China's official drills. As a result, both sides are currently sticking to their own accounts and blaming each other. I believe that for Japan, the key lies in the fact that the reason it dares to take a provocative attitude toward mainland China is that it has a strong backing, the United States. However, during this period, the United States never expressed any form of support for Japan. Therefore, he is now appealing to the United States through the Financial Times, saying that the U.S. has remained silent so far, with only the U.S. ambassador to Japan having publicly expressed support, but there has been no follow-up action since then. An official from the U.S. Department of State only posted a message on the X platform, emphasizing that the U.S.-Japan alliance remains strong, but did not mention the current tensions between China and Japan. The Japanese media outlet, Shukin Bunsan, also reported on the matter. Shukin Bunsan even revealed that the phone call between Trump and SiSTeCATI on November 25th was rather impolite and quite tense in atmosphere. So, how should we view the subtle attitude that the United States has displayed during the recent China-Japan conflict? Trump had a phone conversation with the mayor of Kaohsiung. Although the mayor later tried to play down the matter, at least she only minimized it without distorting facts or lying, which is different from our Lai Ching-te. His statements contain about 30% distortion. The alliance between the United States and Japan remains solid and unchanged. It can be said that he was evading the important points while dwelling on the trivial ones, treating Trump's polite remarks as the main content while deliberately ignoring the key points Trump emphasized. Whether it's the United States Wall Street Journal or Japan's Weekly Bunsan, the latter has long been known in Japan for being adept at breaking stories and exposing inside information. Speaking of the role of the media, since Weekly Bunsan's past scoops have been quite accurate, when it published this report, people generally believe there must indeed be some hidden truth behind the matter. However, when Weekly Bunsan reported on this matter, it used stronger language, clearly conveying that Trump was warning SiSTeCATI not to become overly involved in Taiwan affairs at this time, so as not to damage the G2 relationship between the United States and China. In fact, this is a warning to Japan. Alright, the Japanese side later also reasonably explained the reason why SiSTeCATI kept responding in a gradually conciliatory manner. Although she continued to blur the focus and deliberately go in circles through wordplay and linguistic maneuvers, unwilling to state things clearly all at once, she did so out of her own internal considerations, with the goal of bringing both sides' relationship back to a normal and workable state. Just like during this weekend, several veteran political commentators in Japan have already pointed out that SiSTeCATI is currently facing a rather evident political crisis. She is very likely to become one of the prime ministers with the shortest term. Although this has not yet been clearly reflected in the polls, the situation is highly likely to change drastically. Alright, what Feng Xian just mentioned happened over the weekend. Exercises conducted around the Liaoning aircraft carrier group. Because China is currently extending from the southern part of the Yellow Sea all the way to the East China Sea, and further expanding into the South China Sea and beyond the first island chain, conducting large-scale military exercises on a full scale. All the naval vessels involved in the deployment, including those from the Coast Guard, total nearly 100. I wonder if everyone still remembers that last year the Taiwanese side, together with Japan, released an exclusive global report claiming that the People's Liberation Army seemed to be preparing some kind of military operation and conducting the largest naval fleet assembly in history. The scale of this year's exercise is even larger than last year's. The People's Liberation Army indeed took this opportunity to expand the scale of the exercises and extend their duration to express dissatisfaction and anger toward Japan. However, in terms of scale, such operations will increasingly become normalized because the People's Liberation Army currently possesses an overwhelming number of vessels. When they carry out their annual large-scale exercises, it's likely to involve hundreds of vessels going to sea at the same time. However, what stands out this time is that the J-15 carrier-based fighters have directly confronted the F-15J fighter jets. The F-15J is Japan's standard fighter jet for performing airspace and territorial interception missions. In the past, it was routinely deployed almost every year, conducting more than 1,000 aerial interception operations. The Japan Self-Defense Forces F-15J pilots carry a heavy burden, as they now almost constantly have to face the appearance of PLA fighter jets. In the past, fighter jets rarely flew out to sea, but I estimate that the deployment frequency has now increased significantly. However, this interception is particularly noteworthy because it involved a direct confrontation between an F-15 and a J-15. One of the details that requires special attention is the latitude and longitude of the location. The latitude is approximately 24 to 25 degrees north, and the longitude is around 131 degrees. You know, this concept can actually be illustrated using Taipei City as an example. Just like Fengqing and I are now hosting a program in Taipei, the city's latitude is about 25 degrees north, and its longitude is roughly 121 degrees. Simply put, the dogfight between the J-15 and the F-15 took place in an area roughly near Taipei City, and the related operations were connected to the aircraft carrier Liaoning. At that time, the Liaoning's position was directly east of Taipei, about 1,000 kilometers away along the same latitude. The people of Taiwan must have a clear understanding. If in the future China's combat aircraft carriers impose a blockade on Taiwan, their position would not be near Yonaguni Island, but about 1,000 kilometers to its east. Ahead lies Guam, and behind are the Ryukyu Islands. In other words, they would most likely be deployed in the waters between the Ryukyus and Guam. This time, on the surface, it seems to be an operation mainly led or initiated by the F-15J. Since you are conducting exercises not far from me, roughly 270 kilometers southeast of the Ryukyu Islands, since it's so close, of course I have to observe and see what's going on. That's right. From China's perspective, when my J-15 fighter takes off and engages in a game of hide-and-seek, like confrontation with you in the air, testing each other's flying and tactical abilities, that should be fine, right? Simply put, in this situation, when I activate the radar, it's equivalent to performing radar illumination. The first illumination lasted 3 minutes, while the second one lasted as long as 30 minutes. For the J-15, those 30 minutes of pressure could be described as enormous. The J-15 was the first to come under threat, and the pressure it faced while carrying out its mission was also extremely heavy. Are you referring to the J-15? No, it was the F-15. In the end, the F-15 successfully broke. Secondly, due to the extremely heavy mission pressure, Japan's F-15s have been in a state of high fatigue for an extended period of time. The third point is that when he and the J-15 switched on their fire control radars to illuminate each other, the first illumination lasted for 3 minutes, after which he left. The second time, I illuminated him with radar for as long as 30 minutes. Under such immense pressure, the alarm in his fighter kept sounding, because once locked by radar, the warning would continue to blare without stopping. Apart from the continuous sounding of the alarms, what draws even more public attention is that if Japan has to face the People's Liberation Army alone in the future, the situation will be extremely severe. Regardless of the future Fujin carrier, even the Liaoning itself has already been designated on the Chinese mainland as a training carrier with combat capability. Taking the J-15s on the Liaoning as an example, when the J-15s illuminated them with radar, they repeatedly reported problems during communication with the ground tower. First, the radar was subject to interference. Second, the communication signal was intermittent, and even severe communication difficulties occurred, to the extent that they almost lost the ability to counter the J-15s. What took place between the J-15 fighters was an air-to-air confrontation. The J-15s not only activated their fire control radars for targeting attacks, but also demonstrated strong suppression capabilities in other electronic warfare and radar systems. This put him in a state of semi-interrupted communication, unable to counterattack and finding it difficult to maintain smooth contact with the ground. Indeed, what made them most anxious was that his radar was only partially functioning. In other words, if the J-15 carrier-based fighter demonstrates a dominant advantage when confronting the F-15J, then for the United States, the next possible response would be to deploy the F-35. The F-35 is extremely expensive, and if it were to carry out missions at sea with the same high frequency as the J-15, I'm certain that Japan would also be unable to sustain such a level of expenditure for long. Therefore, in this confrontation, he endured tremendous pressure and deeply felt the urgency and gravity of the situation. In other words, when he deploys the Liaoning and the second carrier-based aircraft formation in that position, Japan will strongly feel a sense of pressure as if it is completely blocked and cut off in the middle zone behind the first island chain, near Guam. Therefore, the focus of this dispute is not only the tension in China-Japan relations caused by Mayor Gao's remarks, but more importantly, that Japan has clearly seen its own weaknesses in this military contest. Even though this weakness has long been openly discussed in the media and among various professional military analysts, the United States still chooses to remain silent. That's right, this is precisely the key point. The United States has remained completely silent. We must examine this in light of the recently released U.S. National Security Strategy, NSS, report. The report points out that the defense of the first island chain will be primarily the responsibility of the United States allies. Today, Japan claims that it is already at the forefront, but the United States pays no attention to this. This is the reality that Japan must face at present. The situation has indeed changed quite drastically. At the same time, China and Russia have decided to hold an anti-missile exercise within this month. This is not only the first in nearly 7 years, but also the third such exercise since the two countries began conducting them. 2 days ago, that is, in our previous episode, we mentioned the meeting between Wang Yi and Xiao Gu. Since the media usually do not report many details, we believe these details are actually crucial. After Japan made its statement, Russia's reaction was unusually intense, even more so than China's. China responded in a cool and restrained manner, while Russia replied with words full of passion and strong emotion. Russia's remarks delivered an extremely strong warning to Japan. During the high-level China-Russia strategic dialogue held between Wang Yi and Xiao Gu, one key topic was that both sides would open up to each other and share system parameters and data links during offensive and defensive operations. As a result, they achieved integration in their air defense systems, and at the same time, during offensive operations, they also realized data link integration and coordination. Although this is not a formal military alliance, I can say that even a military alliance may not necessarily achieve this level of cooperation. Even if a military alliance exists, it is difficult to fully share all offensive and defensive data links and parameters. Therefore, although China and Russia do not have a formal military alliance, they have in practice formed a partnership similar to one when facing Japan. Therefore, if Japan faces China and Russia, it must regard them as being in an alliance. Although China and Russia will not publicly declare themselves as allies, they have in fact formed an alliance when dealing with Japan. Therefore, this joint anti-missile exercise, held after an 8-year interval, indeed deserves close attention. Although it was repeatedly emphasized throughout the announcement that it was not directed at any third country, its intentions and direction are clearly evident. Our time is almost up. Could you summarize in 1 or 2 sentences? During this visit by French President Emmanuel Macron to mainland China, Xi Jinping accorded him an exceptionally high level of reception. You see, Xi Jinping not only met with him in Beijing, but also personally accompanied him to Dujianjian and Sichuan for a second meeting. Such an arrangement can be described as a very high level of reception. Macron said he was quite surprised and moved by the exceptionally high level of reception he received this time, which also reflects the good relations between China and France. This shows that the leaders of mainland China have a special affection for France, which may be related to the historical ties among many Chinese Communist Party leaders in the past. In fact, this has a deep connection with studying in France in those earlier years. The second part concerns Russian President Putin's visit to India. This time, Modi personally went to the airport to welcome him, demonstrating a very high level of hospitality. Although the two sides did not sign any military arms procurement agreements, they opened up broad prospects for future development in economic and trade cooperation. It is expected that by 2030, trade between the two sides will reach 100 billion. I believe both of these relationships are undoubtedly very important, and when viewed within the broader context of Trump's strategic retrenchment, such developments appear particularly reasonable. First of all, for Macron, if he claims to be surprised by receiving such a high-level and warm reception in China, that would be somewhat of an exaggeration. China's warm reception for him, whether in Shanghai before this visit to Shenzhen or earlier in Xi'an, followed almost the same standards and patterns, consistently displaying the same enthusiasm and sincerity.
During this visit to Chengdu, the two sides naturally also discussed future cooperation in areas such as weaponry, aviation, and nuclear energy, which are precisely the fields in which France excels.
Macron is very fond of showcasing the warm reception he received during his visit to China. He often uploads and sends short clips or videos back to Europe immediately, sparking enthusiastic responses from various circles there. Therefore, just after he had barely left, the German foreign minister, who had been denied a visit to China for an entire month, was about to arrive. Do you still remember that this German foreign minister had already expressed a month ago the intention to come? However, after he arrived, no one was willing to meet with him. Apart from a brief meeting with Wang Yi, there are no other activities scheduled. Because his previous remarks were quite impolite, the Chinese side believes that in that case, there is no need for another visit. However, will he be going to Beijing today? Yes, the German foreign minister is indeed coming. After arriving in Beijing today, it was clear that Macron's pioneering visit to China has put Scholz under great pressure. He is very likely to surpass the British Prime Minister in diplomatic strategy. He hopes to surpass the British Prime Minister Starmer, who was originally thought to take second place. Now it seems that the German Chancellor is more likely to catch up and achieve that breakthrough. We see that in the context of the dynamics among China, Russia, and India, from Macron's perspective, France under his leadership will host next year's G7 summit. Have you noticed these three countries, China, Russia, and India? Russia once joined the G7 but was later kicked out. The G7 would like to invite China to join, but China itself is unwilling. As for India, it wants to become a member of the G7 but has never been accepted. In other words, from the current situation it can be seen that under the hemispheric framework advocated by Trump, the G7 will cease to exist. After all, in such a system, countries like Japan simply cannot be included. The last time, he had already shown a clear lack of interest in the G7. After you have read Trump's national security strategy, NSS, the very existence of the G7's future becomes a question. Without the United States, the remaining 6 countries would inevitably fall into a leaderless situation. By contrast, when Putin visited India, it seemed that he successfully reassured and stabilized Modi's position. So, is the person who has steadied Modi? You can clearly sense that he has always wavered and hesitated between the United States and China. Yet in the past, he was consistently very close to the United States. During Biden's tenure, U.S.-India relations were once so good that they were regarded as the best in history. However, it is now clear that the relationship between India and the United States has become extremely strained. Although the future course of action for the Su-57 was not finally determined this time, Putin successfully calmed Modi's emotions, allowing the situation to temporarily stabilize. I believe that in the future, India will become increasingly aware of its position as an Asian country. Recently, there has been a noticeable shift in public opinion within India, and dissatisfaction with the United States has been steadily rising. This time, for Putin, he simply gave Modi a straightforward promise. You need oil. No problem. I can continue supplying it to you in the future. For India, that statement alone was enough. Therefore, India's future will become increasingly integrated into the overall Asian system. Therefore, by comparison, since these 3 countries all belong to the BRICS group, the BRICS framework they represent will become increasingly solidified. In contrast, the cohesion of the G7 may gradually weaken. Therefore, after the U.S. leadership system shifts toward hemisphericization, its previous commitments to the global geopolitical configuration and various supranational organizations may gradually fade or even be abandoned. Meanwhile, the system of southern nations that China is striving to connect is expected to become increasingly consolidated and strengthened in the future. Alright, first we'd like to thank all our online friends for your support. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and turn on the notification bell. Also, please give us more likes to help boost the numbers even higher. At the same time, we also want to thank many good friends for their donation support. Special thanks to Tong Jiayu for being the first to contribute, and to Bravk001. Thank you both for your enthusiastic sponsorship and support. Thanks to Teacher Wang Liang for the donation support. In addition, thanks to a friend named Andy, I don't want to work hard anymore. He said it's been a long time since his last donation, and this time he's specially treating Sister Fengxin and Brother Long to a cup of coffee. Afterward, he generously contributed a considerable donation. He said that after 6.5 years, he finally understood the true meaning of the phrase, "It feels more like being friends." At the same time, he had also forever lost a girlfriend he deeply loved and who had once been his ideal type. He said that the girl had originally regarded him as her future partner and was full of expectation, but at that time he was still a naive boy, not yet ready to respond to her deep and high hopes. So afterward, he did not harbor resentment, nor did he blame her for initiating the breakup. What he felt instead was respect, understanding, and a deep ache of compassion. Compassion for her having rushed between cities for his sake, changed her original plans, and come alone to Shanghai. He said that despite giving so much, he would keep everything buried deep in his heart and remember it forever. This isn't about wanting her to return to his life, but rather a reminder to himself. If, in the future, he meets someone who treats him the way she once did and sees him as a potential partner, he can no longer respond with the same naive self he once was. Alright, come on, CCC. Although it sounds a little melancholic, I think your mindset is very healthy. After all, whose youth hasn't been tinged with a bit of innocence? Yes, it's indeed very healthy. Thank you CCC 1969 for the donation support, and thanks also to Jay-Z for the generous sponsorship. He said that when he recently learned about the news of domestic drug use records being sealed, he was furious. How could they do such a thing? Drugs have seeped into the very bones and are the chief culprit symbolizing the humiliation of modern Chinese history. They should be strictly eradicated. This is precisely the fundamental logic that inspires the Chinese nation to strive for strength, and it is also the cornerstone upon which the People's Republic of China was founded. No matter out of what kind of sentiment or out of so-called compassion, anyone who dares to undermine these principles is like returning to the late Qing era, becoming the sick man of East Asia, with nothing left in the end but a land full of white bones. Not to mention those heroes who fought against drugs for the nation. Their names are sealed, their identities protected, and they can only remain anonymous. But is the reason they hide their names and identities so that drug users can re-enter the system, work in government positions, or even become celebrities again. Slamming the table in outrage, one realizes that the journey of national rejuvenation is far from over, as wolves with ruthless ambitions still lurk on all sides. No matter how learned or authoritative you may be, it was precisely people like this that Chairman Mao sought to overthrow back then. Finally, he shyly asked, "Will Miss Feng have time to attend the roundtable discussion later on?" There have indeed been some initial contacts, but details such as the specific topics of conversation and the invited participants are still being followed up and confirmed. Yes, you'll be able to see it tomorrow. You'll be able to see it tomorrow. But to be honest, I'm really not sure and can't make any guarantees. After all, this topic is quite important. As of now, I'm particularly interested in economics and technology. Although I wouldn't dare to call myself an expert, I'm truly very interested. Thanks to He Wei for the donation support. He mentioned that right now on the streets of New York, IC is randomly checking pedestrians, causing Brooklyn's Chinatown to suddenly become unusually quiet. He hopes that after the new mayor takes office, this situation can be improved. Next is Big Bad Bullying, which should actually be correctly called Bullying League. Support the Shinsho pairing, full of golden quotes. Also, thanks to Jerry Tai for the donation support. In addition, the two guns in one ES hands are of different lengths. Haha, he said, did Brother Long and Sister Feng see that video over the weekend where the wild T-800 kicked the CEO so hard he flew off and scrambled away in a panic? That kick was really solid. An employee nearby was recording while laughing and asking, "Boss, how do you feel?" The boss even felt it should be a bit more sarcastic and deliberately asked, "Boss, how do you feel now? How does it feel?" "Boss, you know what? The reason that robot aroused suspicion is because its movements were just too human-like. Everyone thought it must be controlled by a person. So the boss, the CEO, stepped in personally to face the robot head-on. As a result, the robot kicked him far away with one blow." Laughter. People like the CEO are better left without too much comment. Yeah, humanoid robots definitely have development potential. It's just that the competition is really fierce right now. As for who will ultimately come out on top in the future, it's still hard to predict at this point. Therefore, many of them may ultimately be unable to escape the fate of being eliminated. I only watch occasionally, because I often enjoy some dance videos. In the past, what was called the robot dance imitated the movements of robots, but later it might become a bit awkward, since real robots actually don't move like that. When a robot's dance moves become as smooth as a human's, if you're still imitating a robot to dance, in a couple of generations people might find it strange. Robots don't actually dance like that. Thanks to LV Zhao for the donation support. He said that the so-called American-style world promoted by the United States has never been for the well-being of the local people. Due to the rivalry between the two parties, the United States is able to support agents that serve its own interests, while leaders who do not align with its interests are often overthrown through color revolutions. From Ukraine, Georgia, and Venezuela to the Arab Spring, such examples are endless. Then, Western media use their discourse power to embellish the legitimacy of the protesters and further manipulate global public opinion. For example, in the 1950s, when the two sides of the Taiwan Strait were in confrontation and Taiwan was still under martial law, it was claimed that Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek's rule was the free China, a statement that was rather laughable. Alright, this is Yiming Wu. Thank you very much for your donation and support. Next is YCY0323. His view is that energy will be the most important resource in the future. Therefore, the United States will focus its attention on regions that possess energy, while other areas may no longer receive much attention. Alright, thank you for your donation and support. Next is Toro Speedy. Thank you for your donation and support. He mentioned that while at Sichuan University, he saw Macron running and smiling, and even French netizens and reporters said they had never seen him smile so brightly, suspecting that those students might have been specially arranged. However, those students' reactions were truly enthusiastic. It's no surprise, after all, since a distinguished guest had come from afar. Next is SiSTeCATI. Thank you for your donation. He said, "Let this Americanism rest in peace. After all, it was only a dream." And thanks also to Lunch Egg Sandwich for the donation. He said, "It's like running straight into the era of Cyberpunk 2077. Alright, next up is Minami. Thank you for your donation." From this new U.S. strategic report, it can be seen that although Trump's style of action is wild and eccentric, he remains quite clear-minded on major issues. Moreover, it is obvious that, like Chongqing, Guangxu, Churchill, and Gorbachev, he harbors the idea of saving the gradually declining American empire. However, just like those predecessors in history, no matter what reforms are carried out, in the end it can only be a final flare before extinction. What is destined to perish will still meet its demise, and what is in decline will continue to decline. Don't even mention the United States. He thinks Japan's situation now is about the same. You know what I mean. Thank you for your donation support. Mao Zedong wanted the Chinese people to stand up, while Deng Xiaoping hoped to make China prosperous. I hope Xi Jinping can make the Chinese people stronger, but not necessarily more warlike. Next, let's continue to look at the content below. Next is John Han. Thank you for your donation support. At the same time, thanks also to Stephen Hu for his donation support. Next is Wei Hu 1167. Thank you for your donation support. You're really too kind. He said that this F-15J is a veteran that has been in service for 40 years, while the F-35 is truly a guardian of the airbase. The gathering of over 100 warships, such a formation, is clearly directed at a single nation. On December 13th, the National Memorial Day, the event is expected to be even grander. There may no longer be any truly safe place across Japan, not even in the eastern region. The United States, in fact, sees this quite clearly. Dear HK, thank you for your donation support. He said that Trump was secretly thinking to himself, Macron, this guy, actually received such a high-level reception in China. Last time, we met twice in Beijing and Guangzhou. This time, we ran into each other twice again in Beijing and Chengdu. The previous meetings were casual tea chats, while this time we strolled through one of China's historical sites, Zhejiang. Then next year, you should plan to visit a few more places. Or go back and ask your grandson where he wants to go, and be sure to mention it properly to President Xi. You can't do less than Macron. Mingri Dali, thank you for your donation support. Next up is Lilith Fan. Thank you for your donation support. Thank you for your donation support. He said that Japan seems to be planning to wage a war destined to be unwinnable in a way that would drag down Asia's economy. What is worrying is that SiSTeCATI's thinking may be identical to that of Hideki Tojo back then. If they hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor, how would they have known they couldn't win? The one we should really worry about now might be South Korea. I saw Macron and Xi Jinping going together to visit Zhejiang. Because Zhejiang is one of the greatest and oldest hydraulic engineering projects in human history. That man with the surname Li. Macron even specifically asked him, why has this project been preserved for so long? How could it have lasted so long and still function so well even now? Xi Jinping replied with deep meaning, because this project is the result of going with the natural course of things. Just like when he visited last time, and we took him to Shenzhen. This time, the response was actually quite ingenious. During the previous visit to Shenzhen, we even specially arranged for him to listen to Gao Shanlin's performance, which carried profound significance. Therefore, whether before the visit or after returning, one must first do their homework, so as to understand the profound meaning behind everything the other party has arranged for you. However, when Macron asked that question, Xi Jinping's remark about going with the trend was probably not a prearranged response, right? What I mean is, it should have been a spontaneous and deeply meaningful answer from Xi at that moment. Of course, being the national leader of China is by no means an easy task. He must possess both a profound understanding of history and culture, as well as a broad and far-reaching vision. Guests may raise all kinds of questions at any time. I often say that it's like when he made a state visit to South Korea and presented a set of the 4 treasures of the study to Li Zhanming. As he introduced them one by one, he could clearly explain, this is Huizhou ink, that is a Duan inkstone, and these are Huzhou brushes, those are Xian paper, something that most people might not be able to describe so precisely. That's right, really, yeah? Alright, many thanks to Minami for the donation and support. He mentioned that, not to mention those countries just now, there's still a typical example today, Putin of Russia. To be honest, the reason he was able to come to power was that he promised to make Russia strong again. However, in reality, the outcome has not been like that. Instead, Russia is moving further and further away from becoming a Chinese version of Canada. Therefore, this is precisely the inevitable trend of historical development. There is no such thing as a so-called exception theory. It's just that the forms of decline manifest differently. In the end, what he wanted to express was that, from now on, people in Taiwan will have no reason to say they don't need to use a VPN to get online anymore. A salute to Zia Hongshu. This proves everything, indeed. Next, Thanks to Dr. Naruo for his donation and his appreciation of our professional and objective sharing. Also, to Sangboy Yang here, thank you very much for your donation support. He said that although you spoke very well, it's better to keep it short because talking too much might delay the end of the workday. Not at all. It didn't affect the end of work in any way. The end time of our show has always been decided by Xianglong. That's right, Fengxin doesn't get to make the call. Why do you sound so aggrieved? Just kidding. Okay, thank you to Xinghua Y for the donation support. He mentioned the issue of sealing records related to drug use, personally copied the professional hardware content from the Bilibili channel, Wanjia Academy, and sent a letter to the Legislative Affairs Commission of the National People's Congress on the grounds of suspected violation of the legislation law. So, what actions can everyone take? Alright, next up is Donop Kmif. He said he hadn't expected Taiwan to actually ban Zaihongshu. Now, when it comes to public opinion control, the two sides of the strait have ironically achieved a certain kind of unity. How interesting. Alright, thanks to Minami for the sponsorship and support. He said he wanted to correct Brother Long's view, believing that China would inevitably rise to compete for the world's top position sooner or later, but for now it hasn't clearly planned how it will become a global leader. That should be something that will happen in the distant future. I think that in the short term, China hopes to achieve the two goals of common prosperity and national strength, but there is still a long way to go before reaching them. However, overall, this pace of development is quite steady and solid. The reason I think it won't happen is because of the Chinese national character. So, how did China's vast territory as it exists today come to be formed? If you carefully observe the course of China's territorial expansion, you will find that it has almost never acquired territory by sending troops to conquer a place, stationing them there long-term, and incorporating it through direct control. In fact, most of China's expansion has taken place on a cultural level. In most cases, these regions were originally forces opposed to the Central Plains culture, but with long-term cultural exchange and integration, they eventually and naturally came to form a unified whole. Even in regions such as the Indo-Chinese Peninsula or the Malay Peninsula, which have not yet fully integrated, the cultural homogeneity among them remains very high. So you see, the current relationship between China and Japan, whether in high-level exchanges or in the attitudes of Japan's right wing, is worth deep reflection. After all, people of both countries can still write Chinese characters with a brush and play the game of go together, which truly reflects their deep cultural commonality. Everyone is familiar with classic works such as Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Journey to the West. I understand them, and so do you. This kind of cultural consensus is not about who holds the dominant position or who indoctrinates whom, but rather the result of a long, natural process of formation over time. Moreover, people generally regard those stories as their own. Nowadays, when you talk with a Japanese person about Romance of the Three Kingdoms, they won't think of it as merely a Chinese work. Even though these things originally came from China, they have now become deeply integrated into Japanese culture, and the same is true for Korea. Therefore, everyone has long been nurtured and enriched culturally over time, and there is no need to become overly ideological due to external political provocations, further escalating conflicts that need not be intensified. Alright, finally, thanks to Kenny Fine for his sponsorship and support. He stated that the Democratic Progressive Party lacks the technical capability to make the nation stronger. Lastly, we want to thank Brof Kenny01 for bringing us the conclusion of the program. Alright, we'll see you again tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning's program will serve as the finishing touch. I'll continue the topic I just discussed with Fengxin, delving into the comparison between the J-15 and F-15J in this military exercise, as well as the various details of the naval confrontation between China and Japan. I've already asked Captain Huang Jinhui to do thorough preparation in advance, so tomorrow we can have a good discussion. The day after tomorrow, the richly featured program, East, West, South, North, Dragon and Phoenix pair, will take the stage. See you next time. Bye-bye.